Thank you, Bridget. Yeah, just a reminder to everyone, make sure your mics are off, just in case, so we don't get any wonky interference or anything. Um, as Bridget mentioned, a lot of this is possibly information that you already know or are aware of, so it'll be a great refresher, and maybe some of it is new information, and so we'll be learning something tonight, which will be wonderful. I do encourage you to take any, write down anything that you may have questions about for later on. I'm gonna, it's kind of a lengthy presentation, and I'm gonna move through it as swiftly as I can, but we'll take time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions, be sure to write those down. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Great. Okay, so here we go. First, I just want to go over some meeting agreements. We find that conversations like these are most productive when we have a set of collective agreements that we all adhere to, and here are some general meeting agreements that we like to use. We agree to honor everyone's time, which means that we start and end on time to respect the commitment that everyone has made to participate in this discussion. If more time is desired, we will ask everyone who is needed to continue the discussion if they are able, and if anyone cannot accommodate the request, we will arrange another time to continue the discussion. We agree to one speaker at a time. We agree that only one person speaks at a time and we will not interrupt each other. This may mean that non-speakers keep their mics off during these virtual sessions. We agree to be present. We agree that during these meetings and discussions that we will be in a physical, mental, and emotional state to participate. If we cannot be present in those ways, we will excuse ourselves from the meeting. We may return when we can be present. We acknowledge that we need to be present to engage in the rest of these agreements. Individuals will hold themselves accountable for their own engagement. We acknowledge harm. We agree to acknowledge harm when our intentions and our impact don't align. When harm occurs in the space, we prioritize the person or persons experiencing the harm by interrupting the harm and giving the impacted individual what they need before addressing how or if to continue the meeting. When we have committed harm, we make a commitment to improve and ask what is needed to move forward. We agree to listen to understand. We agree to listen to each other without distraction or predatory listening. Predatory listening is a need or a desire or an overwhelming urge that causes an individual to interrupt a speaker's communication prematurely. It is listening to respond or contradict the speaker. It's a damaging tool to effective communication, understanding, or any attempts to consider another person's perspective. We default to inquiry over judgment. We agree to be curious and ask questions before making judgments. We agree to share the air, to share our perspectives, ideas, and narratives while allowing others to share theirs. And we believe people's narratives. We agree to believe each other's perspectives, ideas, and narratives without questioning, dismissing, or diminishing them. Are there any questions about these agreements? I can't see everyone, but feel free to say so if you have a question. Okay, great, then we will move along. Here are some important things to know before we begin sort of anti-racism and anti-oppression work. Racism is a crisis and anti-racism is a moral imperative. It is vital to have a shared language, so we try to normalize terms like racism, oppression, microaggression, harm, white supremacy, and whiteness. Defensiveness is a barrier to change, which is why listening to understand is far more beneficial than defending past or current behavior. The idea of being colorblind or not seeing race is a form of erasure and has only ever served white people and further marginalized people of color. Race is a part of identity, and by not acknowledging that, you can cause harm. Doing a thorough investigation of race and oppression within an organization is challenging and often uncomfortable, but discomfort is part of the process. Discomfort means that you are hearing things and examining things in ways that you haven't before. Think of it as growing pains. This work is about eliminating racist and oppressive structures and practices, so you should focus on racism as a system of oppression and racist behaviors as reinforcing that system as opposed to identifying racist people. While our engagement with you may only be for a short while, this work is ongoing. There is no box to check off that the work is done. Committing to being an anti-racist and anti-oppressive organization means that all organizational choices are viewed through that lens. There will always be ways to improve and do more. So why is it important to practice anti-racism? Well, it is simply not enough to be not racist. Racism is a long-standing and ongoing global crisis. No individual or organization is insulated from structural racism, and it is only by actively working against it that you can be a true ally. Anti-racism puts action behind not racist. Anti-racism is rooted in the promotion of race equity, which is the condition where one's racial identity has no influence on how one fares in society. Acknowledging that barriers exist due to race is essential in this work. Anti-racism is the consistent practice of eliminating structures and policies that are overtly and covertly influenced by race and reduce opportunities for people of color while providing advantages to white people and those afforded whiteness. Given that barriers exist based on race, it is only when an organization embraces and practices anti-racist values internally and externally that it can achieve true social change. By starting with addressing racism, one of the more insidious forms of oppression, organizations are better positioned to recognize and address other forms of oppression. Racism often operates covertly. Once you have a framework for identifying and dismantling those systems, you're better equipped to do the same for more overt systems. I mentioned the term whiteness a moment ago, and that may be a new term for some of you, so here is what it means. Whiteness is a forced group membership that originated by oppressing people of color. It refers to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. And it's afforded for the purpose of maintaining the dominant culture to people who look white and who have immigrated to America. It's important to understand why we use the word harm instead of hurt. Harm is something that stops, limits, or significantly distracts people from moving through the world in their full potential and takes targeted, significant, and ongoing work to heal. Hurt is about pain, while harm is about damage. Something can be painful without being damaging. This distinction is important because you may experience hurt feelings while doing this work, and hearing the lived experiences of those who have experienced harm can be painful. But it does not limit your ability to move through the world in your full potential. Particular behaviors and practices can be especially harmful because they often reinforce long-standing oppressive systems which already impact people. Here's a quote by author Dr. Henry Cloud. "There's a huge difference between hurt and harm. We all hurt sometimes in facing hard truths, but it makes us grow. It can be the source of huge growth. That is not harmful. Harm is when you damage someone. Facing reality is usually not a damaging experience, even though it can hurt." Now let's talk about the 4 levels of racism. Racism exists on these 4 levels: personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural or systemic. Personal racism is the private beliefs, prejudices, and ideas that individuals have about the superiority of white people and the inferiority of people of color. Among people of color, it manifests as internalized oppression. Among white people, it manifests as internalized racial superiority. Interpersonal racism is the expression of racism between individuals. It occurs when individuals interact and their private beliefs affect their interactions. This is where personal racism shows up in the form of bias, bigotry, or deliberate abuse. When racism is discussed, it is almost always at this level. When people say they aren't racist, they usually mean interpersonal racism. This is racism at its most visible, so it's not surprising that it gets the most attention. But if this is as far as your understanding goes, it won't get anywhere near solving the problem. Institutional racism is discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, inequitable opportunities within organizations and institutions based on race that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people and those afforded whiteness. This is where racial inequality gets locked into the processes of institutions, such as the police, schools, or healthcare. It's not expressed in words and actions, but in policies or practices that treat people differently, even if that's entirely unintentional. Racism at this level is more visible in statistics than in words or actions. We can point to a statistical fact and see a racial inequality, but we can't necessarily point to a racist person and blame them. It's more about outcomes than intent. Structural or systemic racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequality. It is racial bias among institutions and across society. This is where it can get a bit complicated. So let's use a specific example. Across multiple studies around the world, it has been observed that children from ethnic minorities are more likely to be injured in car accidents while walking or playing. There is a racial inequality to the risks that children face while walking to school. If a person's understanding of racism goes no further than interpersonal racism, they cannot engage usefully with this fact. They will look for intent. When no deliberate racism can be found, they will have to either reject the facts or jump to an incorrect assumption about what is being implied. Are you saying that car drivers are racist? This is one of the most common ways that conversations about race go astray. This broader understanding of racism is why we talk about anti-racism and why it is different from simply not being racist. Not being racist only addresses interpersonal racism. It leaves institutional and structural racism intact. To police one's own actions and words, but never act on wider racist structures, is to be a bystander to injustice. Despite the guilt and bad feelings that occur when the nation's racial value system gets exposed, usually by unspeakable acts of violence, the reality is that this country has never done anything to eradicate the root cause of these atrocities. America abolished chattel slavery, but quickly instituted Jim Crow and mass incarceration. It extended civil rights, then proceeded to erode them, especially voting rights. It ended legal segregation, but preserved widespread de facto segregation in schools, housing, and jobs. And despite initiating affirmative action, allowed employment discrimination and vast economic inequality to persist. Because the power structure has always refused to acknowledge the institution of white supremacy, many people do not believe it exists. And most people are confused about what the term even means. Toxic as such beliefs are, white supremacy is not merely the individual delusion of being superior to people of color. Institutionalized white supremacy does not need individual bigotry in order to function because white supremacy is a universal political and socioeconomic system where white people and those afforded whiteness enjoy structural advantages and privileges while keeping other racial groups disadvantaged. Many white people and those afforded whiteness are unaware that this system exists, which is its greatest success. There are powerful incentives for maintaining this privilege and negative consequences for trying to interrupt or reduce its consequences. For there to be oppressed groups, there must also be privileged groups. People from privileged groups generally lack knowledge of the oppression others face, lack awareness of their privilege, avoid or deny looking at others' oppression and their own privilege. Privilege exists for those in advantaged groups, whether they want it or not. Gut checks can be difficult because they have not been socially conditioned to empathize with or prioritize those with less privilege. Privilege feels good, which doesn't provide much incentive to shift social power dynamics. It is challenging to reconcile that the systems that they enjoy, that feel good and give them privilege, also hurt others. Privilege can be material or psychological. They can take the form of more concrete and tangible benefits such as jobs, housing, medical care, education, legal treatment, social power, and more. Privilege can also manifest as receiving more respect, being seen as credible and capable. This can lead to psychological privileges such as positive self-esteem, sense of belonging in society at large, entitlement, and others. Advantages and disadvantages are cumulative and relational. They are not simply unrelated one-time occurrences. This is why a historical perspective is critical. We cannot understand today's situations without appreciating how the past has shaped the present and continues to shape the future. It is important to note that you can belong to more than one group and experience privilege in one space and oppression in another. It is also possible for someone experiencing oppression to be oppressive to others. Anti-Black racism is a specific form of racism that devalues Blackness while systematically marginalizing Black people, the issues that affect Black people, and the institutions created to support Black people. Other communities of color and marginalized groups can perpetuate anti-Blackness by putting greater value on lighter skin tones, perpetuating anti-Black views, encouraging assimilation, encouraging assimilation, cultural appropriation, and oppression Olympics or erasure. Oppression Olympics is a term used to refer to the practice of people from marginalized identities comparing, contrasting, and competing for who has experienced more oppression. This often looks like dismissing issues facing the Black community to center issues facing another marginalized group, or trying to relate to the unique experience of being Black in America to comparing oppression. That might sound like, I know what it's like for Black people facing oppression because I'm gay. This is harmful because it decentralizes Black oppression and also erases intersectionality. Let's talk a little about why we prioritize discussing anti-Black racism specifically. Blackness versus whiteness. These are social and political constructs to identify uncivilized versus civilized. This is why the two are often readily identified in conversations about race to the exclusion of other races. Because of colonialism, power and prestige have historically been seen as white traits. This explains why so many racial groups have distanced themselves from darker skinned people to be seen as more civilized, desirable, powerful, etc. Proximity to whiteness equals power and privilege. More than 400 years of unresolved anti-Black policies have led to the current state of anti-Blackness and anti-Black sentiments. There's US chattel slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow policies, New Deal legislation, redlining, the separate but equal doctrine, over-policing and mass incarceration, employment discrimination, voter disenfranchisement, and many others. It is important to note that racism benefits white people and those afforded whiteness. You cannot dismantle racism without eliminating anti-Blackness. Some of the most common ways that Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color experience racism in the workplace include being ignored, overly criticized, assuming their abilities, being unduly burdened, tokenism, wage disparity, less access or opportunities for promotions and raises, being asked or expected to place the work and or the organization above their feelings and experience, and adherence to white dominant culture norms. White supremacy in the workplace can be defined as the institutionalization of whiteness and Westernness as both normal and superior to other ethnic, racial, and regional identities and customs. White supremacy culture at an organizational level is apparent in the belief that traditional standards and values are objective and unbiased. The standards of professionalism are heavily defined by white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture explicitly and implicitly privileges whiteness and discriminates against non-Western and non-white professionalism standards related to dress code, speech, work style, and timeliness. In white and Western standards of dress and hairstyle, straightened hair, suits but not saris, etc. In speech, accent, word choice, and communication, never show emotion, must sound American, and must speak white standard English. In work style and timeliness, must work at least 40 hours a week. Tardiness and extended breaks are punishable offenses, and time off is a luxury to be earned, and etc. The harm inflicted by a white supremacy culture is that it doesn't leave room for other cultural norms or standards. This is damaging because it promotes dominant ways of thinking to the exclusion of differing ways of being. Perpetuating these norms eliminates discussion of power imbalances between individuals and groups, which stops organizations from creating cultures that center justice. As a result, many organizations either implicitly or explicitly require employees to adapt and conform to the existing culture instead of seeing value in each individual's working style. By defaulting to Western standards, other cultural norms are seen as illegitimate or unprofessional. White supremacy culture can show up in any group or organization, whether it is white-led or predominantly white, or people of color-led or predominantly people of color. Remember that while not all white people uphold white supremacy upholds all white people. Now let's discuss intent versus impact. Good intentions don't always yield positive impact. Many microaggressions start with good intentions. Good intentions don't negate the negative impact that it's caused, and someone can say or do something racist without that being their intention. Remember, you can exhibit racist behavior without necessarily being a racist person. Mitigating impact should always be prioritized over defending intentions. When the impact of something you said or done doesn't match your intentions, listen to understand, not to defend. Center the other person's feelings and not your own. Genuinely apologize and acknowledge the impact your actions had. Steer clear of I'm sorry if, I'm sorry you, I'm sorry but, as all of these lack accountability and put the blame on the person who was hurt. A simple I'm sorry for doing that and I'll do better next time can go a long way. Changing behavior is the best way to ensure that this doesn't happen again. A common occurrence for intentions to not align with impact is when we discuss microaggressions. Microaggression is a term used for a commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. A microaggression is any interaction that either subtly or directly enforces a person's socio-political inferiority as a result of their group membership. A microaggression is micro because it exists on the micro level, at the level of interpersonal relationships, not because it is small or not that big of a deal. It's important to remember that. Microaggressions impact people who live with marginalized identities. Remember, a person can hold advantaged and marginalized identities, which means that anyone can commit microaggressions against someone else, regardless of the perpetrator's race, gender, religion, sexuality, etc. Someone telling you that you've committed a microaggression is not a microaggression. Heightened emotions are common when someone is expressing that they have been harmed. Your hurt feelings are valid in that moment, but should be expressed in spaces that are safe for the people who have been harmed and safe for you. A thing I often say is, just because you need to say it doesn't mean that they need to hear it. So why are microaggressions so harmful? Well, microaggressions are connected to racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., as they are based on some of the same core ideas about people who are minorities or are marginalized in America. For example, that they are not smart, that they don't belong, that they make good punchlines. But microaggressions are a little different from overtly racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic acts or comments because they typically don't have any negative intent or hostility behind them. And as we know, intentions don't always align with impact. Daryl Sue explains, people who engage in microaggressions are ordinary folks who experience themselves as good, moral, decent individuals. Microaggressions occur because they are outside the level of conscious awareness of the perpetrator. This is what makes microaggressions so dangerous. They aren't committed by overt racist, white supremacists, and skinheads, but by everyday people, friends, coworkers, colleagues, family members, and neighbors who say and do things unaware of how they impact people from marginalized identities. Outright supremacists are less likely to affect our daily standard of living, as opposed to those who are well-intentioned yet unaware of their biases. So how do you avoid microaggressions? Well, you make an effort. Put some thought into the biases that you may hold. Become curious about the way your words and actions are perceived by others. Listen when people explain why certain remarks offend them, and make it a habit to stop a beat and think before you speak, especially when you're weighing in on something connected to someone's identity. Now that we have that foundation, here are some ways to create an anti-oppressive workplace. And workplace is a very broad term for a place where work happens. Acknowledge that systemic racism exists and impacts everyone in different ways. Leaders must lead and take ownership of reshaping the culture. Promote individual and group learning about anti-oppressive work practices. Allocate time, funding, and resources to people as well as programs and projects. Create a culture where talking about racism and oppression isn't scary or stressful. Practice transparency around how wages are set and decisions are made. Examine and question existing policies, practices, and structures, and be willing to change them. Own up to mistakes, repair harm, and move forward with greater knowledge and awareness. Okay, I think we're going to take a break now. Is that correct, Bridget?
I think we should. And then you're going to do the second half of your presentation. So we'll do just a little 5-minute.
Great, then let's take a break.
Great. All right, let's take a break. It's 7:08 now. So we'll come back at 7:13. Can we do it? 7:13. See you then.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, hello again. I just wanted to put the meeting agreements on the screen again, just to remind everyone, these are our meeting agreements. And here are some objectives for the second half of this evening. To understand the importance of equitable spaces, to identify strategies for creating equitable spaces, and to create an equitable practice of your own. So that's what we're going to do, talk about equitable spaces. So this is the vessel, located at Hudson Yards in New York City. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was financed and donated to the city by a wealthy businessman, philanthropist, as a public art project. It rises 16 stories and consists of 154 flights of stairs. This doesn't sound like a very accessible space, which could also make it an inequitable space. But look, it has an elevator. So that changes things, right? Well, it might if the architect who designed the space did so with the intention of everyone simply making it to the top. But this structure was designed to be contemplative and meditative, almost like a maze or labyrinth for people to wander through. Two things that don't typically describe a 35-second elevator ride is meditative and contemplative. So people with wheelchairs, walkers, strollers, or mobility issues, they aren't experiencing the space the way it was designed to be experienced. So while they may have access, their experience is significantly limited by the design. The vessel is the perfect example of how the expression "all are welcome" is not the same as "this was created with you in mind." So what is an equitable space? It's a space where everyone is respected, valued, and equipped to fully participate as their preferred self. An equitable space should also feel safe for each person, but only individuals can decide what is a safe space for them. Declaring a space as safe often reinforces power dynamics. You cannot abdicate your power, so acknowledge it and use it to do good. Super important. So why are equitable spaces so important? Well, inequity and oppression are the fundamental barriers to inclusion. By centering equity, you bring down those barriers and create opportunities for greater engagement and learning, which ultimately leads to greater inclusion. Oppressive behavior often reinforces historical hierarchies of power and belittles the experiences, emotions, and thoughts of historically marginalized communities. Oppressive behavior holds us back individually and collectively from reaching our full potential. While individuals are not necessarily responsible for oppressive systems, we are responsible for our choices and behaviors which either uphold or disrupt those systems. So I trust that we've all been in a traditional classroom setting at some point in our lives. Here are a few examples of how inequities show up in those traditional classroom spaces. Limited or no bathroom breaks, limited seating options or uncomfortable seating options, different punishments or repercussions for similar behavior, one-size-fits-all lesson plans, and underrepresentation in sample texts and sources. Now, thinking about your experiences with WIT, what are some maybe inequitable practices that you can think of that have occurred in either a classroom, a rehearsal room, or performance space? And you can leave your answers in the chat. We'll take like a minute or so to do that. It can be very small, it can be not so small. Something that inhibited your ability to fully participate as your preferred self. Okay, let's give maybe 10 more seconds. Okay, thank you all for that. And we are going to come back to those. So glad they're in the chat. And feel free to continue adding things to the chat if it occurs to you as we continue. Here are some ways to promote equity in learning spaces. Incorporate culturally relevant teaching, emphasizing justice and activism, talking about how it's everyone's responsibility to participate in those things, in justice and activism. Make it safe to fail. Instead of shaming learning groups, neutralize failure by making it an opportunity for learning. If one person has the wrong answer, it is likely that others do as well. And view culture as a resource. Avoid cultural blindness. Value cultural differences. Examine teaching materials. Incorporate literature from authors of historically marginalized communities and work with students to analyze historical narratives for bias. Now, here are some tools and things to consider when evaluating perhaps how equitable your space may be. The physical accessibility of the space. Is it easy to get to? Is it easy to move around in? Does everyone have their own work or storage space? Is there access to water, bathrooms, emergency exits, etc.? Are there clear expectations? Is there structure within that space? Clearly identified and outlined routines? Have you identified conflict resolution pathways and identified consequences for undesired behaviors? And also, is there shared responsibility? Are there room agreements? There someone keeping time? Are there student-led assignments and projects, etc.? And student is a very wide definition of student in this case. As artists and arts administrators, we can design more than props, costumes, and scenery. We can design systems. We engage with systems every day, like our government, education, healthcare, and even oppression. All of these systems were designed by people. We can shift our idea of design from object making to systems building. Systems of oppression such as racism, sexism, and poverty were designed by people who made intentional choices around exclusion. If systems of oppression can be designed, then they can also be redesigned. So how do we go about doing such a thing? Well, here are a few ideas to get started. Acknowledge how existing systems of oppression show up or may show up in the space. Center the needs of people over the needs of a production or an organization. Consider the ask of participation, the location or distance, the time, accessibility, compensation, etc. Identify resources to eliminate barriers, travel stipends, meals and snacks, counseling services, etc. Create, communicate, and utilize a conflict resolution policy, feedback protocols, rehearsal and production meeting agendas, etc. Hire a creative team and admin team that reflects the cast and desired audience. Cultivate new leaders who will continue this work. Cultivate equity designers. A wonderful design is meaningless without someone to steward it into fruition. That's where facilitation comes in. You design a system of equity and then facilitate that system. The goal of the facilitator in an equitable space is to ensure that the entire group is empowered to reach the objectives of the gathering. An effective facilitator does the following: ensures that everyone can participate and not just those who feel most comfortable, prevents and interrupts attempts by individuals or subgroups to dominate the conversation or the group, prevents and interrupts harm, and ensures the group follows its own agreed upon rules for discussion and decision making. Now, these are what a great effective facilitator does. Here are some common facilitator struggles. Not setting clear boundaries around your role as a facilitator, not setting clear expectations, agendas, or objectives, getting pushed around by members of the group, allowing people to interrupt each other, focusing too much on process details, not leaving time and space for people to reflect on or share their feelings about the discussion, activity, rehearsal, or process, and balancing sticking to the set agenda and adapting to the group's evolving needs. So before we take questions and move on to our activity, I would like to leave you with some parting thoughts on anti-racism and equity. Creative spaces are not detached from the outside world. We must acknowledge its influence, utilize its gifts, and mitigate its harm. It won't be perfect, but it can be better. Let your guide be, how will this impact others? You don't have to have all the answers, you just have to be willing to find them. Individuals are in the best position to identify solutions to their needs, so ask them. And the process should be just as rewarding as the product. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. I know that was a lot of information, so I'm gonna stop sharing now. And I'm gonna ask, are there any questions on anything that I went over this evening?
And I guess before we even jump into that, I want to acknowledge that I see, a number of people sharing some challenging experiences that they've had with WIT in the chat. So thank you very much for sharing those. When we get to the activity after this, we're going to be talking about how to address challenges like that. So I don't want people to feel like you've put your experiences into a vacuum and they're not being read. So we will be addressing them in a bit. But yeah, let's do Q&A. And if you can use the raise hand feature, that would be really helpful because there are a number of you.
Christina, yes.
It's maybe because is not my native language, or maybe my brain just skipped because it's after work time. I am not entirely sure what do you mean by people afforded whiteness or something like that expression. That was confusing to me.
Sure. So the concept of whiteness is it's a tool, it's a system used to maintain the status quo, the idea of sort of white dominance and superiority. So people who look white are afforded whiteness. So people oftentimes with lighter skin tones who are not, maybe even not even necessarily American born, when they come to this country, they are perceived as white and therefore treated as white to sort of maintain the idea that people of color are inferior to those who are white. It maintains the ratio and the status quo of white dominance.
I guess that kind of turned out ironic because I'm one of those people. As long as I don't open my mouth, then you can't really tell that I'm not the American white person, but an immigrant.
That's often how whiteness works.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to remember that whiteness is a forced upon thing. So people don't opt into it. You don't have to say, hey, consider me a white person, right? It is a thing that's sort of put upon you by others by perceiving you as white. Any other questions?
I have one more.
Sure.
Because the whole, growing up in Europe, I knew what the word racism meant, but I had no understanding of it at all until I came to the US and I had to actually actively seek knowledge about it. And in the meantime, I also have experienced that sometimes that other people of color on the street were treating me like with some hate just because I look white. And I'm still puzzled about that. And I don't know what I can do, how I can best react, what I can do when this kind of thing on occasion happens. Do you have any advice for that?
Unfortunately, I don't have great advice for that. I think the best thing that I have to offer for that is an understanding of the history of racial dynamics in this country. and how a great deal of harm has been perpetrated by white people and those afforded whiteness to people of color in this country. And so when there is tension and hostility, perhaps I know it's asking a lot, but understanding the history of where that comes from in this country, and knowing that it is not a personal thing. That's what I mean. I know it's a big ask to recognize that it isn't about you specifically, but it is about what people at least perceive that you are representing.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I think Hillary has her hand raised. Oh, I think you're muted, Hillary.
Sorry, let me say my question. I put it in the chat and I have a couple typos. So you two are wonderfully presenting and sharing, educating a lot. You represent both a lived white experience and a lived Black experience, male and female. What can you say when you talk about that role of facilitating once you've sort of designed a space, when you don't have a co-facilitator representing the people of color or a non-mainstream white perspective, how to still be as effective as possible? Or do you advise trying to get help?
Yeah, do you want to take this one, Bridget?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think it's probably, I'm sure you have helpful insights into this as well, which is sort of part of the point. You know, I think that for me, my lived experience as a white person is something that I acknowledge, right? Like when I enter a space, I am entering with an awareness of all of my various intersecting identities and how they show up in that space, who might be in that space. I think that ensuring as a white person that you are educated on how power and privilege move in a space, how they show up, you know, that you have tools at your disposal. That's part of the work that we're about to be doing together, so that you can use that power that you have as both a facilitator, right? That's positional power, and identity power to prevent and interrupt harm. And so I think that in some ways there's an incredible benefit to being a white person in a facilitator role, who is prepared to use that identity and positional power to make space for other people, to intervene in moments of harm, right? And a lot of that is about being prepared and also being very aware of the identities that you hold and how they show up in that space. What would you like to add, Jared?
No, I agree with that. I think also one of the great things about designing a sort of more equitable space is very much what Bridget was saying. It allows other people to speak up. So you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know every single thing about every single thing, right? Other people will say, hey, you know, that thing that just happened didn't